All right, everybody, welcome to the August 2025 monetization panel. I am, as always, super excited to listen and somewhat be on the panel, but mostly listen because we have Talia as our moderator. We're super honored to have her. Today, we're going to talk about I just posted on LinkedIn what I consider the most important, that's my hot take, the most important thing in mobile gaming right now, which is the changes on Apple, the changes in the EU, and most specifically, DTC, direct to consumer web store. So today's discussion, we're going to break down the court-ordered web store changes, Apple's new EU policy, and how it's somewhat of a non-starter, and then other DTC-related updates. For subscribers, there are two reports we're going to go over. Jennifer, who is in the chat, will drop those links in there. For non-subscribers, welcome. We are happy to have you, and we are making this available for everyone thanks to our sponsor, which is Stash. And we have Archie here to talk a little bit about Stash. Archie?
Sure. Yeah. So Stash is a D2C provider. I've been doing it for a number of years. We're really focused on providing like really premium player experiences that drive the highest percentage possible traffic to direct to consumer. That's like our core number one metric as Stash is like what percentage of your revenue can we get going through D2C? So like full end-to-end solutions, web shops, launches, loyalty programs. We also do APK distribution and launches for desktop. And yeah, really just trying to be the kind of like I sometimes say like the off-platform platform, the white label platform for developers to distribute directly.
Awesome. Thanks, Archie. Yeah, we've been happy to be sponsored by Stash for a while. Great people, great stuff. Everything's been awesome. So, and we're really thankful for allowing this to be available to everybody. Before we jump into the content, quickly meet the panelists. Talia.
Okay, so I've been in the gaming industry. I've been gaming my entire life. I've been working in the gaming industry for over a decade. Started in research and moved into strategy, and was really lucky to work in an area where it wasn't just the numbers, but also the products behind it, what it is that made the numbers tick. As my grandfather says, do something you love and you never work a day in your life. I've spent my entire last decade of my life playing games for a living and can't beat that.
I don't know, like I
Okay.
love games, still feels like work, to be honest.
So you need to play
Okay.
a different game then.
Okay, yeah. Like I'm not doing it right if that's how it's meant to feel.
I'll go next. So hi, I'm Guy. I can disclose that I work at Plarium and I have been for almost a decade now. Will be around decade this October actually. Had a chance to work quite closely with Talia in the research department, but for most of my time there, I've been doing business development, and inside business development, a lot of it was actually platform partnerships. So I've been the one actually working with Apple, Google, and the other platforms. As you may know, Plarium is also Plarium games are available on PCs, and some of them are fully cross-platform. So we've been working with PC and mobile storefronts for ever since I've been there.
Sure. So I entered the industry in an investment capacity. I was at a fund called Makers Fund for a number of years. I was there for like 5 years plus. And then over the last kind of 2.5 years, I've been doing direct to consumer. Initially as the head of product at Stash and now as chief growth officer. So I set the kind of long-term product roadmap, company vision, and also spent a lot of time talking to customers and trying to make sure Stash is kind of moving ahead of where the industry is going to be.
Hey guys, Michael Lewis. I am at a company called Dios. It's a game streaming startup, pretty early stage. And prior, I was at Take-Two for about, I think, 6 years doing direct to consumer. Take-Two is a big game publisher, making Grand Theft Auto, making a couple games on the Zynga side. Own 2K as well. And prior to that, I was over at Twitch for a little bit, and then at EA doing direct to consumer. So about, I think, almost 20 years now doing D2C. So lots of kind of changes and adjustments in the space, and really excited to talk more about it today.
So before jumping into the actual slides, I wanted to highlight, one of the things I was really excited about getting this panel together was the different directions, the 360 holistic view that we have going into this. We've got platforms management, we've got D2C technology, we've got how to do it and how to pull the players over. We're bringing a 360 view all together so we can see the entire picture and make it so that it's possible for anyone to make the choices about what it is they want to do. So why is it that we were starting here? Why is it that we need to have these choices and think about what it is? And there's where we get into the gossip and the legal aspects that make this all going on, and a little bit of a fun topic. Guy, with your background and you've been dealing with this hands-on for the last 9 years, why are we where we are today? And what is that situation looking like?
Things have been moving in, this trajectory that we see today for quite some time. Okay. It's mostly a matter of what a platform used to be and what it is considered to be these days, right? Everybody's talking about, the storefronts and the standard, 30% rev share that became the de facto pricing initially. And when, the incumbents initially, even before mobile storefronts, before Apple and Google, that became a standard over PC, Steam, and on consoles. Okay? And when the industry moved from retail and physical product, physical merchandise, to digital, 30% seemed like a good enough business model, because on retail, when you had to ship product and inventory and share it with a lot of layers in the middle, you ended up with a smaller share of the revenue. And then storefronts standardized this 30% rev share initially. And it was a bonanza, because instead of paying 60%, you started paying 30%, and that allowed digital distribution to become what it is today. However, one point or another, some of the developers are starting to look at the numbers, the unit economy, and they realize that what they've been charged for basically billing services is not what they could get alternatively over other digital avenues, most notably direct to consumer. Okay? So in between regulators, legal fights, and a few other emergent competitors that tried to push this percentage down, a lot of companies realize that, hey, we can have a better deal. And that's what we're seeing now, moving on all channels, right? One of them is the regulation, the other is just legal prosecution, and the third one is basically additional direct-to-consumer routes. But then the platforms that do make a lot of money from the 30% rev share obviously do not want to give that away, and that's where we see all of this struggle, right? These struggles right now around what they're legally allowed to do, what they're not legally allowed to do, what they should be doing, and what they should not be doing. Okay? Eventually, there's going to be a number that's going to be the new number after this whole thing, settles down. All of these platforms will have to align on a specific number. The only question is what this number is going to be.
Archie, how close do you think we are to finding that number? And that we keep being like, the legal happens and then gets argued, and then the legal happens again, and then something else changed.
Yeah.
Where do you think this is going?
I'm not sure there will be that much alignment, to be honest. I think we're entering a more fragmented era where different developers are at different levels of adoption of direct consumer versus third-party distribution, as well as there being global fragmentation and then fragmentation across the platforms, which we're already seeing. I mean, for the last 3 months, you've had a situation where iOS in the US is allowed to link out, doesn't have anti-steering provisions, but Android does. I think, if this Google ruling comes into effect, which I think it's almost certain to in some form, we'll be in a situation where Google is a far more mandated open platform than iOS in the US. And as such, you'll see kind of the imbalance shift radically in the other direction. I think similarly in Europe, Apple has so far drawn a lot more scrutiny from the European regulators, partly because it's conventionally had a much more closed system than Android. And as such, you're seeing real bifurcation in the policies there. So I actually think we're likely to enter a world in which, one, there's a lot less long-term stability in platform policies, and two, it's a lot more varied. I will also say that I think one of the reasons you didn't see any movement on this for years, right, like over a decade, is because developers were not keen on pushing the boundaries here. And the app stores did a lot more to justify their commissions. Back in the day, the good old days when like Apple and Google's storefronts played a much bigger role in organic discovery, for example, and featuring made more of an impact. I think developers, this was not something they were going to push on. However, these days, where basically all these stores do is commodity distribution services, and developers have dealt with the trauma of IDFA deprecation and have a real motivation to establish direct channels, I think something is kind of permanently switched where developers will no longer be so deferential to store policies and will start pushing the boundaries. And so what you'll probably see is a game where like developers make a move, the app stores make a move, and you continually see developers innovating in this space. So I don't think we're in for it settling down anytime soon, to be honest.
Do you think, because the app stores are also controlling the rankings and things like that, do you think developers need to be worried about making these choices and putting up the fight?
Well, Archie just said that featuring and organic discovery on the storefronts is not what it used to be, anymore. Okay? At the same time, I think that the platforms themselves, the storefronts, their best interest is that their users will, be able to see what are the most interesting games to play, what are the most relevant apps for them. So this kind of organic discovery channel has to remain regardless of what they're making out of it. And if you look at the numbers today, if you look at the top ranking charts, right, it's not that Apple, Google, and the others are punishing games that base their revenue on in-app ads and not in-app purchase, despite not making money from them, or apps that use different billings that are not even selling digital products. They're still being featured at the store prominently. Okay, so eventually they'll have to think what's best for their users.
In regards to the different elements, the different orders of what's going on, what does this new fee structure mean, Guy?
So essentially, we have the interpretation of the law by Apple, right? And they have some wiggle room there, but essentially, in the US, it's much stricter in terms of what they're allowed or not allowed to do, or how they're not allowed to block developers from surfacing their own alternatives or take any share of that source of revenue. Okay? So the US specifically, as of May this year, became a open game for developers who want to use any alternative direct-to-consumer routes, be it full-fledged web stores, checkout pages, or anything in between.
What does this mean in regards to the decisions about, what people have to consider, especially because you've got the EU with one aspect, people in the EU, the US. How does it affect how you're dealing in each country?
Right, so that's where the complications start, right? The EU regulation is supposed to work on the same principles or similar principles, but because of the way it was phrased, Apple had more wiggle room there to decide that, hey, if you're in the EU and you want to utilize one of these routes, you have to do A, B, C, D. And here you might actually not be able to offer in-app purchase as alternatives to your own billing. You'll have to choose one of them, and you'll have to choose one in every specific region. And oh, PS, if you're going to choose, this option and not the option that we favor, you're not going to get a whole lot of services that have been fundamental to the store from the get-go. Okay, so there are some, very minor carrots there, but it's mostly sticks if you want to take a similar route in the EU. But you still can if you choose to.
I think Julia said it the best. Ouch. Archie, from a technology standpoint, what are the workarounds for this? What are aspects that companies can use to, be able to approach this and get the most money in their pocket?
Yeah, I mean these terms are completely non-viable for almost any developer, so I'm on board that I would never there has not been a modification to App Store policies whereby you have to opt in to some alternative link out provision that has been economically worthwhile. So I think it shows that Apple's really clinging on to this. I mean, that basically leaves you in the world that existed in America before May and the world that's always existed in the EU, whereby you are not allowed to link out directly to uh, web stores, checkout links, etc. So what we've seen in America is kind of two developments since the Epic Apple decision in May. The first is just more explicit and direct link outs to web stores. And then the second is developers implementing direct checkout links. So that's links to a web-based checkout page immediately from within the app, a bit like what Epic's done. So you will not see any of that happen in the EU under these laws. What you will see is a continuation and expansion of what was happening previously, where you are not allowed to talk about the web store from within the app, but there are workarounds. So you can create web-based engagement functionality that you can link out to. This is a big part of what Stash does. So building engagement systems, mission systems, other things that you can do in your web store that are compliant with App Store policies to be mentioned and linked to from within the app. That's even as basic as having a daily engagement gift or a mission system whereby when you progress in game, you achieve some sort of milestone. You are then served a link that takes you to the web store to claim claim some kind of reward or progression milestone. And then from there, in the web environment, you can direct players into a purchase environment. And I would broadly say what this means is that what there's kind of how do you bring your players to a web store? There's basically what you can do in app and what you can do out of app. So what you can do out of app is, you can do whatever you want, basically. That was the first consequence of the Epic cases back in 2021. Then there's what you can do in-app, and I would say developers should use the in-app environment to do one of two things, or actually both things. But the two strategies you can do in the EU are one, either use the in-app environment to acquire and build out-of-app communication channels, get players' emails, get them to follow you on Facebook, do whatever you can to establish some kind of out-of-app communication channel. And then the second thing you can do in-app is exactly what I was describing earlier, which is build in these systems that you can compliantly link to without getting any entitlement, like loyalty programs, mission systems, etc.
We're gonna go through all of those in a couple of slides, dig into them, bring in Michael's expertise here
Hey.
from his experience of doing that. And, I know Guy has had some experience with it as well. But Guy, in regards to, the changes that have happened regarding what you can tell players, how you can tell them, can you tell us a little bit about what limitations still are, around this from an Apple point of view, from a UI UX standpoint?
Right. So, except for the concessions made in the US after the court ruling, it's basically the same game. It's basically what Archie mentioned. You cannot talk directly about alternative purchase methods with your players inside the game on these specific platforms. Okay, what you can do is you can get their attention via newsletters, via social community channels, and then in those channels you are allowed to mention other benefits that these players might be able to get if they, go on the web store. But you cannot mention something like that directly inside the game, except for the changes that we've seen in the US on the App Store right now. That's the only path where you can, specifically say inside the game, yes, you're now allowed to, purchase via our web store, and you can get this discount or these additional benefits. That's the only exception. Other than that, do not mention that directly inside your game, or you might get in trouble with the platform.
I just had one
So,
thing to throw in real quick, which is just that, this is all totally a moment in time. And I think if you reflect back for a bit, to what this was like 2 years ago, it was a much different landscape. The EU stuff in particular just feels like they're, clinging on for dear life to try to operate within the bounds of the most beneficial possible view of the EU ruling, and this stuff's going to get reversed, and they're going to end up with a landscape that's a lot closer to what is going to happen in the US.
Indeed.
okay, so that takes us into the next question is, what do you guys think is next in regards to this? What does this mean and what's
I
coming?
mean, I just think it's going to end up looking a lot more like other categories of apps. You don't have to look that far. Yeah, this, I think if you look at buying tickets or Amazon or, a multitude of other apps where, you associate payments with an app directly or with a service and then make purchases directly within the app with a tokenized payment method without all this weird link out stuff, you're going to end up there for users in the vast majority of countries. I don't know if that's 12 or 24 months, but that's it's not 5 years, and that's where we're heading, I think.
Archie, in regards to things like other native payment solutions and, side loading, all of these different aspects, do you think any of that can play into this, and how?
I do, yes. And I think that's probably part of what's next is an expansion of that practice. It's funny because in some ways that's the oldest form of direct to consumer. Like the original players in the space, like Playtika, have predominantly scaled D2C revenue through side loading. In some ways, they're an exceptional case, but I do think that, well, one, on Android, there's, the possibility that this becomes a lot easier in the US, which I think is very likely that the UX friction for sideloading in both the US and Europe will greatly diminish on Android. And so I think more developers probably should be exploring non-web-based ways of distributing their game directly, whether that's sideloading on Android or desktop distribution for cross-platform games, which I also still think is an under-tapped category of direct-to-consumer. And I think that in Europe, on iOS, it's a little less clear how this is going to evolve. Apple seems very, very protective over their app environment, and I think it's conceivable this never materializes, but I also think it's feasible to see the EU at least have a significant expansion of alternative app distribution, especially once the UK's policy regime comes into effect, and it looks a lot more like a unified kind of Europe regime, which should be sometime in 2026.
So, Guy, with your vast experience across all of these different aspects, what do you think, and your experience of looking historically at all of this, what do you think is next?
Right. So historically, games have already, they already became much more cross-platform, right? A lot of games, most of the leading games in a lot of categories today are already fully cross-platform, PC, mobile, sometimes consoles. It started, I think, it goes back as far as Hearthstone, but Genshin Impact truly made, and it truly left a mark when it became like cross-platform between console and mobile, right? So essentially, game developers should think about their audience first, and let them play on their chosen platform, get the game through their chosen discovery method, but also pay with their chosen, D2C channel. So it's all about giving choices to the players, but at the same time, trying to see what works best for you as a developer, what you get the best margins, because you might be able to pass some of these benefits to your audience. I would say that we've seen. I think it started with, again, from console to PC. We've seen Microsoft migrating most of their games to PC, and now they're a full third-party publisher on PlayStation. Then Sony started bringing their games to Steam, initially quite late after their original launch of PlayStation. And then we saw Google coming to PC with their storefront. Now you have Google Play on PC. And after some time in beta, they actually forced all of the games to be default to opt in into the store. So unless as a developer you now disable your game availability on Google Play on PC, it will be there on the store. And they did it with some sophisticated tech stack behind the scene that can get Android games to run on PC without involvement for the developers. Apple did exactly the same thing on the Mac, on the Mac store. The Mac App Store is basically now allowing you to play iOS games natively on a Mac. Apple took care of this workload. If I had to take a wild guess, I mean, if I was Google Play, I would just bring my Google Play storefront to iOS in the EU, right? So the end result would be maybe more beneficial for me as a platform. There's nothing technically legally stopping now Google from bringing Google Play to iOS. If they can achieve it technically, they can actually benefit from that. Okay? So we'll see, I think, a lot of that happening in the near future, a lot of cross-platform and portability between PC, mobile, maybe even cloud.
If we're looking at it, D2C challenges for checkouts and going through the apps still to try to take that approach from a technical standpoint, what are the main technical challenges that would go along with that, Guy?
It's becoming easier on all aspects, right? You have your payment on record right now on your wallet on your phone. Okay, so even if you choose another D2C avenue that's not, in a purchase by Apple, you can still use Apple Pay via a third-party store. The same with Google Wallet. At the same time, you have QR codes, and I know Stash implemented a nice system there where, on your web, you open your mobile phone, you just click on the QR code and the game connects you automatically. No need for logins, for remember passwords, all of that. So we have more technical tools now to help with these barriers. The biggest challenge was always getting somebody to take out their credit card when they're playing a game and deciding to actually spend something in the game. Now it's getting so much easier. You just need to give them something good.
Archie, from the standpoint of the technology for the games of making the connections, what are the frictions that still are in place, and what frictions can be overcome? What are ways of overcoming those frictions?
Yeah, I will say, I think we're quite surprised by how high the conversion numbers on our iOS link out interface are, and we've gotten those higher by quite significant degrees. But really, you're seeing like less than 10% drop off in conversion from purchase initiation to completion. Now, that's specifically on iOS link out, and I think the way we do it is very slick. If you remove that, and I think a lot of other studios and developers have room to iterate there and innovate, and I think people will continue to, but like the link out conversion flow is incredibly smooth. From a broader D2C kind of technical challenge, there is one technical challenge that I think trumps them all, which is your catalog management, which whenever I start speaking to developers who are adopting a D2C solution, they kind of are quite dismissive of this challenge. They think like, oh, the catalog's just a component of the store. But actually, like the catalog is the store itself, and it is by far the hardest thing to do. There's kind of three parts to the technical lift to launch something like a web store. The first is identity and account linking, which Guy mentioned. The second is catalog, and then the third is purchase receipts, like an entitlements system. The first and the third there are pretty simple. It's the middle one that's a real challenge because if you only sell your catalog currently on one device, which is almost always the case for developers, and you need to suddenly launch another instance of that catalog, well, you have all sorts of challenges related to, real-time synchronization, reflecting your segmentations, sharing purchase limits across environments, preventing players from gaming the system by buying some kind of highly scarce, highly valuable bundle on both storefronts. And in general, I would say like the solution is principally to try and build an environment that treats its store as another instance of your game store. But what I would just tell most developers is like one of the key metrics I think not a lot of developers pay attention to is this metric of like what is your catalog coverage in direct consumer? Because almost always that's like the number one cap on max D2C monetization that I see with web stores.
Just one
Okay.
other thing on that real quick. I totally agree with what Archie said there. This is one of the things I, kind of got to appreciate in working at Amazon was just they have this concept called demand weighting, which is just weighting based on sales. So if you have a million SKUs, let's just say a million different books, but one of the books sells 10,000 times more than the next book, looking at your catalog based on each item and what percentage of sales it constitutes, and then making sure, the SKUs that drive the highest percentage of sales are reflected on the web store. That's the once you have a team that is on board with doing a web store, the next thing I'd always get them to focus on is getting that coverage, offer coverage as high as possible.
And so when you're talking, we're, getting into the strategies to actually make the players make the purchases and do the purchases. When talking about, there's the elements that Brett covered in this report of dynamic linking. And Michael, can you talk us through this a little bit and explain the concept?
Sure. Yeah, it's really simple. It's just essentially when you display a SKU or when you display an offer for sale, like let's just say the Spotify 1999, premium plan in the screenshot here, deep linking into checkout for that SKU, signing the user in and then letting the user buy that rather than taking them to, an overall store page. This is like again, the most important thing I think from a funnel optimization and conversion perspective, imagine if you clicked on a item in your shop and it just refreshed the shop. It's taking the user directly into checkout for the SKU that they want to purchase is super important, and then signing them in so they don't have to sign in again. Those things are critical. That if you aren't doing that, you could take that 90% conversion rate Archie mentioned and bring it down to 30%. It's life and death.
Yeah, and the nice thing is this is in some ways by far easier than supporting a separate instance of your catalog because
Way easier. Yeah.
wait,
And I would just say also on that, like, I think that the web store concept is like a stopgap. I think it's the best we as an industry could do with the tools that we had, but we're going to look back at this in a few years and just think that it's, kind of crazy. And instead, concentrate on deep linking into the SKU that the user wants to buy, directly instead of the whole tabbing between the web store and not.
So now we get into how to convince them. You've got the alternative payment options. What do you do to talk to them and make it happen? Starting here with, how do you show it to them?
Yep. Yeah, these are great splash screens. I'd encourage everyone to think about this think about it in a user-centric way and start from the top. So, think about as a user, how are you exposed to this in the first place? What are ways you can get somebody on board and comfortable with the concept? Thinking about it from the perspective of different segments of users. So users who have already transacted with the web store, or users who have transacted, previously, toning this sort of thing down for users who are already habitual purchasers for it, and then punching it up for users who are more regular purchasers. And then I think these kind of, interstitial splash screens are awesome. And doubling down and emphasizing more in ways that are, contextually relevant for your game, that there's benefits for purchasing off platform, I think is really helpful. Um, I don't know if we wanted to talk about this here, but there's, I won't even say there's two schools of thought, but there's two ways to approach it. One is plussing up the value of an offer with additional content, and then the other is discounting. I'd say like you should always try to plus up the value of the offer or concentrate on limited or exclusive offers versus discounting, because it's, a disaster to train people to try to, if you're constantly just discounting things through the web store, then you're going to train your players to habitually deal seek. So I think, this approach of making a clear CTA, plussing up the value of the offer, and then deep linking directly into checkout for the SKU the user wants to purchase is great. And then just thinking about some of the antecedent steps for users who have never tested out web stores. This is the best way to do it.
So when you're going through and testing through with this, what is the best method of checking to make sure to see what works for you, trying to make sure you're not cannibalizing yourself, but at the same time, trying to push players as hard as you can?
So I think this gets back to, this is going to be different for different genres and types of games, and depending on how, effective the syncs are within a game. But I think the most important thing I've seen in looking across a lot of different types of titles is making a really strong first purchase offer. Make an offer that is limited in quantity, that's under, this is like an offer that's targeted at, not the highest monetizing cohorts, but making an offer that's like so obvious and good, like this kind of 200, 300, 400% value for an initial offer, getting users to buy that, and then, using that to get a payment method on file is critical, and is the most important thing to do. I think battle passes can be a good opportunity for doing that. Just because, it's an offer that a lot of players in the game will buy. It's something that they're habitually aware of. And then showing an immense amount more valuable with a web, D2C purchase flow is a good way to kind of anchor the D2C storefront as as really valuable. That's always kind of my first recommendation to game teams is like, think about the anchor offer in your game, limit the quantity on it, and make it overwhelmingly more valuable in D2C, and then reinforce that you can get this there. That's, I think, the strongest way to start.
Brett, you broke down and you guys went through and analyzed different web store battle passes. What did you see was the strongest outcomes and the key element that, if you would take one battle pass, what thing that you saw, what would you say to do with it? To make it so that people buy this battle pass on the web store as opposed to their game.
I mean, I think like Michael said, I think these type of players are generally very value conscious. So what we're seeing is that battle passes, like we just talked about a battle pass that was a 1 day battle pass, for example, like they're demonstrating a lot of value to the players. And when I was on the game team side, I was always surprised with how knowledgeable players were about our game, oftentimes more knowledgeable than we were. And so probably the most important thing for this particular player type is that they're getting a very strong ROI, because they're very knowledgeable about that. And you see that in a lot of our breakdowns in terms of battle passes or deals or promotions. And like I said, we just talked about it, where players are getting a very significant value for what they're spending, and battle pass tends to be extremely valuable for highly engaged value specific players. So I know it's kind of like a basic answer, but when you go and look under the hood, it really becomes probably the most important thing.
So we've talked about how to get the players there with technologies behind it. How do you keep them there? How do you keep them in regard making their purchases where, on this other side and taking the extra step to do it, taking the extra clicks? What are the best ways to push loyalty programs to make players want to keep going?
Could we just back up for 1 second though, just onto the actual tactics? Because I think that there's a lot of potential things, but I think, they're not all created equal. And at least what I found in looking across a lot of games is the combination of that daily streak tracker, just a very simple reward mechanic on the web, combined with the link out onto the store, combined with getting the offer coverage as high as you can. Like the formula is kind of that simple, I think. And there's a lot of other things you could do. But I think if you could just nail that, you have a store that has, call it 70 to 80% demand weighted coverage of all the offers. You have a daily streak tracker, you're messaging it in game and linking to it every day. And then you're, using that daily streak mechanic to deep link into it. You have a formula there with those tactics that will work across the globe. And I think that, starting with that and then eschewing kind of everything else until you've done that, that's really the consistent recommendation I'd have. And then, worry about the email collection and other kinds of communication down the road, but just like nailing that small set of tactics to the exclusion of everything else is what I'd, kind of recommend.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's like fundamentally not rocket science, but a lot of stores still get this wrong. And I would actually say like we can all have a reasonably intuitive sense of like what this involves. I mean, I think Michael calls out some specific, especially highly effective tactics, but it's almost more about like not screwing up. And I think there are some things that like you basically want to avoid doing, like not having enough of a value proposition on the web store when players visit it. Like the players are incredibly skeptical of these experiences. And so if you have like one time where they visit the web store and there's just not a valuable offer or no rewards or anything like that, you really could screw up that player's relationship to the web store forever. But I would agree completely with what Michael said about, making this a habit, having like short loss avoidance oriented streaks to build daily habits, and then ensuring that whenever they visit the web store, there's something there of value. If you do those things, you kind of are in a pretty good spot. The one other thing I would add to that is creating a inherent sense of progression on the web store is something we've seen incredibly valuable, where players have some kind of progression system on the web store that rewards them for web store engagement, kind of no matter what it is. That kind of just gives them a general sense that like spending time doing things on the web store is valuable.
In regards to, spending time doing ways to keep the players on there, we have the loyalty programs that are outlined here. Are there other methods that you can think of that can hold them there longer?
Yeah, I mean, I think just that daily streak mechanic is good for both of these, for both these tactics. Just I know it's like really simple, but just having the, punch card or any other basic mechanic where users are incentivized to associate or to, return to the store every day is super effective. People just claiming their reward with a, 7 or a 10-day, kind of grander chase reward, I think is, at least from what I've seen, is super super effective. That's the tactic I always kind of consistently recommend to studios.
So we got 8 minutes left to wrap up here. Can each of you describe the best way that you can imagine to draw the players to the web store? What offers would they see? What would they do? How to get there? How to make the purchase and then stay there?
Okay, so it's actually two different questions, right? Like how to get them there and how to make sure they stay there. So getting them there is actually the easiest part, right? You need to give them an offer, make them an offer they can refuse. Give them an offer that's good enough for them to say, you know what, I'm going to stop whatever I'm doing now. I'm going to go to the web store. I'm going to check this free offer or deeply discounted offer. I know it's a one-time deal. Maybe it's, maybe I have FOMO because it might not be there, next week. And again, I think Archer, someone mentioned in the comments that like getting, payment card on record is like the hardest part. That's the reason for them to do that. Okay. You can cannibalize on your sales if your game has the the economy and monetization depth to do that. Okay, you can give a lot of stuff for free or on the cheap and get them there for the first time. However, you cannot cannibalize on your own sales for too long, and at the same time you want to give them an excuse to get her back to the web store again and again. So again, what Michael mentioned earlier, I think that getting them to go to the store because there's some added value on a daily basis, because there is a streak, because there is a battle pass that you can where you can get some additional value. That's the most I would say straightforward play. And it's not the game industry didn't even invent that, right? That's why you have frequent flyer miles in all of the airlines. Okay, so it's not something that's actually a value. It's not a discount. But once you got there, once you're on the roll, the more you keep engaging with that specific channel, the more rewards you might be getting. So I would say that this is the straightforward playbook.
So Archie, Nadav highlighted and said it's 100% about creating a habit. So if you're describing the best way to create that habit, what's the best example that you have seen to make that happen?
I think, I mean, I can try really hard not to pick one of our own stores for the sake of neutrality. I will say, I think some of Scopely's games do this very well, like WWE 2K or WWE Champions or Marvel Strike Force. What they have is just like very simple, powerful 3-day streaks, I think, where you have accumulating rewards over those 3 days, and then you get like some big payoff after them. That's incredibly effective. I will also say, I think regularly educating players about the web store, like a lot of this is about how you explain and onboard them to the web store's value, and then repeatedly surfacing the web store's value. Like we have a mission system that's just like a simple weekly mission system, can either integrate with your game using engagement, or it can use just a real-time counter. And that allows you to 3 times a week serve a pop-up in the game saying like, hey, you've just completed this mission. Go to the web store to claim this link. And then once you've got them in that environment, you can walk them through all the other benefits. So some combination of like constantly having something they can claim there, like a daily check-in streak, as well as repeatedly surfacing some kind of value, especially achievement-based value, in the game.
Michael, the one thing we haven't talked about here that was highlighted in this report in regards to keeping players at the web store were credits. What is the best practice that you feel for working with credits for players to keep the players in the web store and keep going with the web store?
My 2 cents on this, honestly, is like it's a lot of lift to set up an alternative currency for a lot of titles and to make a store and a catalog that have alternative currency monetization and payouts. It's also like kind of abstract for users a lot of the time. So I know, Marvel and a number of titles have experimented and have kind of gone all in on this mechanic. I just think that there's things that the vast majority of stores could do that are going to be higher yield than really investing heavily in a loyalty or a alternative, kind of currency mechanic. And I would just say if your game is under, 30 to 40% of revenue flowing through D2C, I would urge, titles to pursue other tactics until you're there. Archie, you.
Yeah, if I could just add to what Michael's saying, I think one of the reasons you see this tactic is because it's a way of circumventing that catalog integration challenge. And basically, these stores are unable or unwilling to invest in making their catalogs on the web store reflect their in-game catalogs. And so, as a way of circumventing that, they basically introduce this additional currency layer that is I think, less good experience than just supporting your same catalog.
I'd say you're better off coming up with a systematic way, looking across the, content for sale in the game and finding a way to plus up the offers with additional value than investing in an additional currency is my 2 cents. The other thing I'd add, sorry, there's two kind of things I wanted to touch on real quick. One was just I think Archie's comments about the catalog management thing are spot on and probably merit another discussion. And going in the direction of having the game's backend telling the store in real time what the actual catalog should be in a way that's personalized for the user, I'd really strongly recommend, rather than relying on a lot of, kind of third-party tooling and systems for it. Having spent a lot of time building a lot of that stuff, what we found was it was much better for the game PMs and the game team just to tell us in real time what offers to show for which users. The second thing I'd say, I'm just going to paste this in chat. I think the tactics here, measuring what percentage, in terms of what to do, starting by measuring what percentage of people visit your store on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, tracking that and making that kind of like the leading edge KPI that you start with. Looking from there, like messaging the fact that your store even exists. So again, on a daily, if people in your game monetize on a daily basis, you should be messaging that the store exists on a daily basis. Daily streak's a great way to do that. Getting to 80+% offer coverage in the store on a demand weighted basis, and then just always signing the user in. I think if you start with that kind of small set of tactics, you can start to get to north of 30% coverage quite quickly.
Thank you guys so much for all of the information you shared today. I personally got a lot out of it, and I read everything ahead of time. So thank you very much in regards to the information.
Thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Excellent.
Thank you
Feel free
so
to
much.
message.